Episode 419 of the Paddock Pass podcast is brought to you by Renthal Street, KTM and Fly Racing, so check out their websites for the latest bikes, aftermarket parts and safety equipment. As ever, though, our midweek show is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. The midweek review show is a Q&A from all the interactions that we get on Patreon from supporters, so check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast if you want to get your questions asked and answered over the course of a Grand Prix weekend. We also have an extra incentive for some of our Patreon supporters, and that's where if you become an annual Paddock Insider, you'll be able to enter our draw for a pair of roaming grandstand tickets to the British Grand Prix. We've got 3 of these pairs to give away, and the roaming grandstand ticket's a great idea. You're able to move all the way around the circuit, and anytime that I've been at the British Grand Prix with friends and family, that's the ticket that I've got for them. And Adam, Silverstone are really excited to be involved with us on this competition.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. I was speaking with Alison Hill, who works at Silverstone at the recent Monster Energy Track Day of Legends. And, it was something that they wanted to get on board with. Of course, they've just finished the Formula One, so it's been a particularly busy time for Silverstone. But yeah, to be able to give these tickets away is pretty cool. I mean, all people have to do is sign up to be a Paddock Insider, and you're going to get a shitload of content anyway through the year through being with us, as well as going into a draw of not that many people to get these tickets, which would cost more than the subscription anyway to Patreon. So I need to check in with Alison again this week, because there's a chance that Silverstone could also add some more goodies on, so maybe like a paddock tour or something else. So get involved, guys. Sign up. We'll just pick 3 people out of the hat who want to go to Silverstone, who can go to Silverstone. They're obviously based in Europe or the UK, and then we'll try and get some more competitions coming up, because I know you've got someone like a lead from Arai as well.
Yeah, we've got a competition coming up from Arai. They've been gracious enough to give us a helmet, so we're going to get that done in the next couple of months as well. And a little bit like what we had earlier in the season with the paddock passes for one of the races during the year, trying to get another couple of paddock passes organised, and they'll all be competitions for our Patreon supporters. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast to sign up. And as I said, this is a Q&A show, and all the questions are coming from our Patreon supporters. And Neil Morrison, I'm coming to you straight away for the first question we have in. It's from Adam Cole. This actually looks like it's in alphabetical order just because Adam's going first. It's a little bit random, but Adam gets his question in, and he's asking which of the upcoming rounds give Marquez the best chance to pick up a race victory, and whether or not we're now seeing the big difference between the GP23 and the GP24 in terms of that outright performance.
I think we are seeing that, Steve. I think we've been seeing that quite clearly, maybe over the last 3 or 4 Grand Prix. I think it's kind of underlined some of Marc's feats to be there with the likes of Pecco and Martin in the last couple of race weekends. So, well, certainly at Mugello when he was just hanging on there, and then at Sachsenring as well, where he had pretty much a similar pace to the top guys. And I think if we're looking at races ahead of where he could potentially do it, I mean, Aragon is the one that stands out to me, just because it's an anti-clockwise layout. Marc has always been ridiculously strong there. And yeah, obviously plenty of left-hand turns for him to try and build on, or kind of, put his advantage that he has in left-handers to good use. So I think that's probably the most likely one, although I think Dave has a slightly different opinion.
I do have a very different opinion. As I think I said on the Sunday night show, I think he's going to win in Austria. I think he can make up for the shortcoming in acceleration in enough places to actually get past. So and to beat Pecco and Martin. But we'll see. The Ducati, the GP23 has a massive shortcoming in terms of acceleration to the GP24. We saw at Mugello where it was almost embarrassing the way that Enea Bastianini just walked away from Marc. But I think, I don't know. I've just got a feeling that that's where he's going to sort of strike the first blow. But I mean, he's also going to win at Aragon, so you're absolutely right.
And Dave, you mentioned the word embarrassing there, which is actually quite apt, because I did listen to the show on Sunday. And Adam, when you were mentioning about the fantasy and our lack of performance, I'm blaming Jorge Martin fairly and squarely on mine, because I had him as my boosted rider. And for 28 laps, I thought, I'm quids in here. I'm making a return to form. I'm coming back up the standings, and I'm going to make this work. And I think that kind of ties in nicely to a question we had from Stefan. And Stefan has asked us, is the championship already decided? Has Jorge Martin just given himself too much of a hole now, maybe, with the form that Bagnaya's in?
I mean, lol, no. It's the correct answer. I mean, there's 407 points left, lads. There's a long way to go. What has happened is that the momentum really has shifted in Pecco Bagnaya's favour. Also, because there's now no reason there's nothing to stop Ducati from openly favouring Pecco Bagnaia now. Whereas before it was, look, Jorge Martin is leading the championship. We're going to treat him absolutely scrupulously fairly. But now they would be treating the rider who is no longer leading the championship, who is leaving at the end of the year, and who is riding for a team who are also joining Yamaha at the end of the year. So I think they have every reason to favour Bagnaia. But I mean, if there is something that's true in recent years, is that riders like to fall off when they're leading races. We've seen Martin do it. We've seen Bagnaia do it. Everyone loves to crash out of the lead. So I think it is. I think it's a very, very long way from a foregone conclusion. And like I say, yes, the momentum has swung towards Bagnaia more, but I mean, there's so much racing still to go.
Going back to Marc briefly, I mean, he's got 4 podium finishes, this season, which is less than 50%. We all thought that the championship would be a formality if he got on a Ducati, and it's just been far more complicated than that. And the fact that he hasn't qualified that well in majority of the Grand Prix is something that's been hampering him, because you can see the raw speed is there, and he's able to balance the complications of tire pressures, group warfare, injury, satellite team little gremlins that don't tend to happen in like the factory team. But, as for the championship being over, I mean, I agree with Dave's reaction. I mean, there's just far too many points still to go, because Marc is going to win at some point, and that's going to take some points away from either Jorge Martin or Pecco Bagnaia. But, the thing is that the way the championship will flow once we get into the later stages, again, as Dave was hinting, how Ducati deal with the fact that they're employing a rider that's going to leave their camp next year and ride for a rival, then that's also something that's going to come into play when you consider the whole strategy. Because if they have all their chips on Bagnaia, and it's not going to be, say, Maverick Viñales or Brad Binder, who's another rider that fell off while in the lead, Dave, as recently as Valencia, then it's going to work out that way.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well with Marc. You mentioned it there, Adam, about the podiums. But it's the troughs that we've had as well. If you think to Portimao, the Coda obviously was one where we all expected a lot from him, Aston as well. And then everything else has been in that 3rd, 4th, 5th kind of bracket. So for Marc, it hasn't been as smooth as we thought it would be. But he was still the rider of the Grand Prix, picked by our Patreon supporters, 55% of the vote for him. And one of the questions came in saying that it had to be Marc. It's hard to be running at the front all weekend like Pecco and Martin, but it takes balls to do what Marc did and limit the damage after his crash. And Neil, it also kind of brings us to your predictions for the weekend, because you were one of the guys that got it right. You were able to say on Patreon that you were expecting it to be a Martin sprint win and then Pecco to win the main race. So we'll all tip our caps to you for that. And Adam, as gracious as ever, and as gracious as I'd expect him to be. But Neil, when you look at what Marc did at the weekend, obviously you talked about it on the Sunday show, our roundup from the weekend, but now there's been a few days after it. It doesn't get any less impressive from him.
Yeah, it doesn't, Steve. Yeah. The more you kind of take into consideration what he did, the kind of more impressive it is. And, you mentioned that there's been a couple of rounds where he's been off it, but I think generally speaking, he has been competitive, more like, podium competitive, maybe even race win competitive. He was leading in Cota when he crashed out. He was, I think, going for 4th in Portimao in just his 2nd race when he had that collision with Pecco, and probably would have been higher if he had qualified better. But yeah, Sachsenring, I think, was his best showing of the season, and there were so many reasons to think that this was not going to end well. And certainly there were points over the weekend where I just thought this is going to be like a repeat of 2023 when the Sachsenring was pretty much his nadir with Honda, just because, as Frankie Carcetti said, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And for him to kind of keep his head together and to kind of produce a late performance in the race like he did with bruised ribs after his airbag had deployed with that collision with Morbidelli, when he certainly would have been feeling a lot of pain. It was pretty remarkable. So I think his best performance of the year, maybe a little frustrating that it got away, but still, brilliant, really.
Yeah, and just on a personal note for me, I was in Spain at the weekend actually and watching the races, and everyone was a Marc Marquez fan, and in the pubs, just watching it on the big screen, everyone was cheering him on, and it was good to see, because obviously for me, I don't tend to get a view like that. You're usually watching at home, so it was good to be able to see how people were finding it at that moment. We have a question from Richard Eriksson as well, and this kind of ties in with somewhat we were talking about there, but the last time we had a world champion who didn't crash out of multiple races. The example that Richard has brought up is Joan Mir back in 2020, but Mir had a tough start to that season in the 2 Jerez rounds, and then obviously Portimao was tough at the end of the year, but his run in the middle of that season was super consistent. And Richard's just trying to think back to a time when we didn't have riders just having the crashes like we saw from Jorge Martin and trying to challenge for a world championship. So if anyone's able to jump in with what they think about that.
2019, Marc crashed once. I mean, he was either first, second, or he had one crash at Austin, which again wasn't even his fault. That was an electronics issue, I think. Before that, I mean, I think you used to see. I think Valentino Rossi had a year where he won almost everything, but had one crash. But I think it's really difficult to have a full season, especially now with the sprint races. It's really difficult to have a season of 18, 19, 20 races and not fall off, and not make at least one mistake. That kind of focus and sort of just commitment, especially the focus, keeping your concentration for that length of time and keeping your fitness and everything, your sharpness for that length of time, being able to ignore everything else that's going on around you, is just incredibly mentally stressful. And you're going to make a mistake at some point, and choosing when you make a mistake is really, really difficult.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for me, actually, Dave, just that you mentioned that, because I was writing all my previews for the Donington Park Superbike round. And one of the things that, just when you were looking back at last season, you just remember just how dominant Alvaro Bautista was. He won 15 of the first 16 races. And it's a little bit like Marc was back in 2019. But to have that consistency, it was just something else. And like you said, it's difficult to do that year on year. And that's where a season like that really does stand out. Just on to the next question. Tim Kendall and Eric Harvey were asking us about the tyre pressure rules and the regulations and the impact that they're having, and whether or not there's any changes coming from Michelin, or whether or not that the rule can actually be rescinded by the FIM. Obviously, the ride height devices and different things have had a massive impact on the tyre pressure rules, but is there any sign that these are going to be coming to an end down the line?
I mean, if I can jump in here, the answer to that is no. I mean, the tyre pressure will change once we get a new front tyre, eventually. Even then, there will still be minimum tyre pressures. There are minimum tyre pressures in Moto2 and Moto3 as well, because there was for a little while there was a rumour that Fermin Aldeguer might have lost his win due to tyre pressures, but he ended up being inside the tyre pressure and stayed on in Moto2 at the Sachsenring. But no, I mean, we're stuck with this. We're stuck with this. When we get to 2027, when we lose the ride high devices, when we get a lot less aerodynamics, then tyre pressures are going to be massively less important. It's especially the ride high devices and the aero which is causing the problems.
Sorry, just to butt in there, Steve. But I think the plan for the last couple of years for Michelin was to come in 2025 with a new front tyre, but there really hasn't been so much word of it this year. And you would imagine, if there was a new tyre ready to go they would be sort of forcing everyone to test it. I think I saw Matt Oxley reporting a few weeks ago that it might be pushed back to 2026 before it comes in. But yeah, as Dave said, I mean, it's pretty much dependent on the front tire changing. And I know a lot of people are always asking, you know, if Michelin were able to make overnight tires for riders back in the mid 2000s, then why can't they just do this now and bring it in to kind of change the whole thing? The kind of problem is that the current MotoGP grid has based their bikes around to kind of feel around Michelin's front tire, and it's not something you can just change overnight. It's something that you have to gradually test through a season, which is difficult anyway because the teams and riders are already, you know, they're focused on that season and improving for that season, not thinking necessarily about next year when they're maybe midway through the season before. And yeah, so it's no small matter. I mean, you know, you just sort of have to look back to when Michelin first came in 2016. You know, the sort of dramatic adjustment that the bikes needed for 2016 from 15. So yeah, I think it's not something that can be done quickly.
Michelin's current contract ends 2026, right? I mean, that's before the new technical rules come in. I mean, it's feasible that we see a new tyre supplier for a fresh era of MotoGP's technical rules. I mean, that could really shake things up and make things pretty different. And of course, if Michelin do stay, then they're working towards a new sustainable model that they're currently trialing in Moto E. So there's probably a likely chance that the whole sort of tyre situation or panorama is really going to shift in the next 2 to 3 years.
I mean, yeah, it's my understanding that Michelin are interested in staying, and Dorna want them to stay as well, I think. But just to come back to the tyre pressure, the other thing is with the ride height devices and the aerodynamics is it's a moving target. We saw, for example, again that Yamaha bought a new ride height device, an automatic ride height device that Remy Gardner was trying. Ducati keep on finding more horsepower, more downforce, lower ride height devices. The same with KTM. So every time Michelin sit down to design a tyre which will cope with the new with sort of the forces which are being put on them, the manufacturers find a way to put more load onto the front tyre, more stress, and so it sort of starts out handicapped anyway. It's just the direction of MotoGP is going until we get new rules in 27.
Adam, Neil managed to grab a few minutes with Joe Roberts after the race, but one of the things that's been popping up for a lot of people is Joe's prospects of getting into MotoGP. Obviously, he's got 120 starts under his belt in Moto2, but the change to Pirelli has really allowed him to flourish, and he's up there contending for the World Championship. Looks like a changed rider. Looks like he's got a lot more confidence with this era of Moto2. What are the actual chances of him being able to become a Premier Class rider next year?
Well, I mean, as we've said, and I think it's been discussed in quite a few sort of media outlets in MotoGP, Joe has the right passport, and whether that would make a sort of romantic and decent fit at Trackhouse with Aprilia is one thing, but then, you know, he could also fit into a Ducati satellite team, because I think Dorna are very interested in making that happen, obviously because of the new owners of MotoGP and the wish to expand more in the North American market. But, you know, it seems that the Trackhouse link, which is the easiest one, Steve, is getting a little bit weaker by virtue of the fact that Justin Marks, Davide Brivio, and maybe even Aprilia themselves want that team to be a high-performing outfit. They don't want to be like a junior team or, you know, a satellite team as such, or a development team. And if they sign up Raul Fernandez again, then you kind of have that young rider who's perhaps on the precipice of breaking through or not. So can you really afford to take like a Moto2 rider that's taking his time really to find the right sort of chemistry, either in terms of team or tyres, to really make an impact in MotoGP? Joe seems like a decent rider. I would put him up there sort of, you know, at the level of like Jake Dixon, for example. But I mean, he's not like a Pedro Acosta. He's not a world champion like Remy Gardner or Raul Fernandez or Augusto Fernandez, who have come through. So it's a little bit more of a gamble. And, you know, if you are Aprilia and you need some continuity in your project, then perhaps you need experience, somebody like Jack Miller, or, you know, to re-sign Miguel Oliveira, which I think is their first priority.
I think the other problem is that because you're also seeing this with Tech 3 signing Bastianini and Viñales, no one has a junior team anymore because everyone thinks that they can win the championship. And so they really want as many experienced riders, fast riders as they can, having a shot at the championship. Which I think is bad for the championship because no one wants to give a rookie unless they're exceptional. I mean, I think we'll see David Alonso getting a shot somewhere at some point, but unless someone is truly exceptional, people don't want to risk giving the bike to a rookie because people think, oh well, you know what, we might be able to win this. We want as many people at the front as possible.
I think the Roberts thing, one thing that maybe also counts against him is the fact that he's 27. He's not a spring chicken, and normally riders stepping up into GP from Moto2 are 22, 21, sometimes even younger. So you would say that Joe's kind of in his prime at the moment in terms of age. But yeah, I think that's maybe one thing that MotoGP bosses are looking at that suggests that maybe it won't happen. But one thing I think that is worth considering that would be in Joe's favor is that look at where, what other American talents are there coming through. I mean, in Grand Prix, there's none. There's some talents, obviously, in America at the moment that are very young and that I think are hopeful of coming across to Europe, which could eventually end up there. But that's no guaranteed thing. So in one respect, if you want an American in MotoGP in the next few years, Joe's the man. Joe's the person to put your money on, because it's not like in 5 years there's some other new kid coming through. Sean Dillon Kelly was the next bright hope, but that didn't quite work out with the American racing team. He's back racing in Moto America now, and I think when you see what happened to the likes of Sean Dillon Kelly or Rory Skinner, coming across from a national, or even Cameron Bobier coming across from a national championship and being thrown into Moto2 is so difficult. So yeah, I think that's something that maybe the powers that be need to keep in mind, that Joe's kind of the man to do it if they do want an American there.
Yeah, and Neil, just to cue up the few minutes you had with Joe, the weekend was a really impressive performance by him. A little bit like what we were saying about Marc Marquez. He properly gritted his teeth to get through this one. Only gave up a point to Sergio Garcia, and now he's got 3 weeks to get himself fit again. And then he heads to Silverstone, where he had one of his best races last year with a 4th place finish.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was a fantastic weekend on the whole. As you're about to hear, I don't think Friday morning went particularly well. Joe was in a hell of a lot of pain. Even just getting into his leathers, you could see how much he was wincing and how difficult that was. Gradually built his way up though, and yeah, I mean, his race was really impressive. He had a bit of a tough first couple of laps, but then when he found his rhythm, he was climbing places. And if you looked at his speed at the end of the race, he was good enough to be on the podium. And this is at a track where Joe is a terrible record. In years gone by, I think he had a best finish of 13th. So the Sachsenring was by no means one of his better venues. So again, it's I think it's evidence that he's pretty much strong everywhere this year. And yet to finish 1 point off Sergio Garcia, the deficit in the championship is 24 points, which is, I think, a 16 point or maybe 16 point difference to what it was before he broke his collarbone. That's really decent damage limitation, I would say. So yeah, it bodes well for the second half of this year.
Yeah, and let's hear from Joe.
I'm sure you've maybe even surprised yourself with that performance today, Joe. Like, what a ride to come home in 8th and to be like pretty strong at the end there, showing like podium pace. Yeah, man, fuck. If you would have asked me, it's been honestly a wild week. A lot of pain, a lot of physical and mental as well. And, just to be sitting watching the Aston race in a hospital, on a bed, it was just not fun. And but today, I had all this confidence coming here. Like I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna ride. And first session on Friday, I got the suit on. It's like, oh, this is a little more uncomfortable than I thought it'd be. And then the first laps, my whole face went white, man. It was the most excruciating pain. And, just a new suit and all this stuff, just pushing on it. And so to go from how I felt on Friday to setting second fastest lap of the race and 8th, and like I said, podium pace, I think that's just it's like a win, man. I mean,
just this team, I just don't want to let them down, man. They never give up, honestly. Kept thinking about this video from Nicky back in 2006 when he had his got taken out in Portugal, and I've watched all his interviews after he won the World Championship, and the only thing he kept saying was just he never ever gave up, and I've just remembered that, man. Can't ever give up, not in this class, not from what we've been doing all year. We got to keep pushing, and awesome weekend.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like a complicated race. You've got some scuffs on your leathers, and it looks like you were getting a bit beaten around in the first couple of laps, but you were able to put some good moves on people.
Yeah, man, I don't think the other riders cared that I was injured. They were ready to take me out if they wanted to, if they had to, but no, I made some good passes. Like, one of my favorite passes I made was in turn 3, just up the inside. My bike turned so well, found that in Mugello, just being able to carve the inside of the corner. My team just had given me such a good bike to be able to do that. Honestly, I think the thing that just stopped me to keep progressing forward was just my physical strength, and just was a little bit down today. But yeah, I was able to keep the tire kind of more or less pretty good and keep the pace with the guys at the front. So yeah, I'll take that as a win.
Yeah. Just one last thing, Joe. You lost 1 point to the championship leader today. I'm sure that must give you a massive amount of confidence going into the summer break in the second half of the year.
Yeah, I mean, that's just exactly what this weekend was about, was to minimize the points deficit. 20, I think it's 24 points now. I mean, that's doable, man. We're still right in the fight, and can make this thing happen.
Well, brilliant work, Joe, and thanks.
All right, thank you, man.
Great to have Joe Roberts on the podcast and assessing his German Grand Prix. Adam, I'm going to come to you next, because this is a question from Rasmus about MotoGP right now and the dominance that we're seeing from Ducati. Rasmus is a little bit down on MotoGP because of the fact that since Coda, every podium's been locked out by the red bikes. But is there a reason to be optimistic that next year is a bit different? Rasmus has mentioned we lose 2 Ducatis for next year. Bastianini's gone, Martin's gone, and maybe there's a chance that for next season we've got it a little bit more competitive or a little bit more varied at the front of the field in the Premier class.
Yeah, I mean, don't lose the faith, Rasmus. I mean, I think the racing this year has been spectacular, regardless of the motorcycles. I know there was a phase once in MXGP where the powers that be were really unconcerned about what motorcycles were on the track. If it was a gate full of KTMs, as long as the racing and the entertainment and the spectacle was good, then, what did it matter about the bikes? I mean, that was one philosophy you could say is slightly extreme, but it has been pretty much what we've seen in MotoGP in the last couple of years. But, Aprilia, you have to say, are the second best manufacturer at the moment. KTM is so close to solving out the way they can maximize the current tire allocation. And, you could question some of the riders moving to KTM for next year thinking, well, why? Because they seem to be struggling. I think that's a question we've actually got coming up in the show, Steve. Sorry if I'm getting ahead. But, if the racing is good, then, there is a part of me that thinks, does it really matter if it's on a Ducati? If it's on a different motorcycle? Of course, it's such an important ingredient, but, if we're getting good entertainment, then let them crack on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the risk for next year is that, if Marc Marquez is this competitive in his first year on a GP23 versus GP24s, that next year Marc might be a little bit special. He might run away with it. But the things are coming good. Also, for example, I've really been enjoying the story behind Yamaha. Yamaha are going to be making progress. They're making a lot of changes. There's a lot of things happening there. Next year they get 4 bikes. That's going to be a really big step for them. It's going to be really important for them. The Ducati are getting 6 bikes, and Pecco was really pushing hard to have 4 GP25s next year, because there's talk that there'd only be sort of basically like 3 factory supported bikes, because he's saying like all of this data is really, really, really important. So I think it is going to have a big impact. The Ducati still have a massive advantage, but I do think their advantage is going to be reduced. And again, I think Aleix Espargaro and Maverick Viñales. Maverick Viñales is a fantastic racer who is just not consistent. Aleix Espargaro achieved the absolute maximum out of his career, but was never a truly great rider. Jorge Martin, I think, is a much better rider than Aleix Espargaro, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see him on the Aprilia next year. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic about next year.
The thing is, Dave, the only kind of catch of Yamaha is they've got 2 seasons they're going to have, before everything resets. And, by the time they get 4 bikes on the grid and they accumulate and make the most of the data, even though they're moving much faster than they have perhaps in the modern era in MotoGP in terms of motorcycle development, it might still be a little bit moot by the time, we then get to sort of talking about 850s. Of course, R&D departments inside these large manufacturers spending millions are going to be probably thinking about the next phase of MotoGP from 2027. But in terms of their immediate competitiveness, it could be just a little bit too late. And, all the data and everything they get going over the next season and a half is going to build towards the future of Yamaha's racing. But I wonder whether we will actually see them winning Grand Prix in 2025, perhaps 2026. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we shall have to wait and see about that. But I do think that in 2027, the rules are definitely going to be shifting back towards the Japanese factories and away from Ducati, because Ducati have mastered this. They've found a way to make to use massive amounts of horsepower, using the radar devices, using the aerodynamics. They've understood also how to use the aerodynamics to get a lot of ground effect to help the bike turn. When we go to the 850s, we're going to see bikes which turn more naturally have more of an advantage, and I think that's going to help the Yamahas.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath out for a Yamaha win. I'm a little bit more in the Adam camp for this one. Neil, Adam's actually queued up one of our next questions about the rider choices at KTM for next year. But before we get to VJ's question, just a quick question for you as well about Pedro Acosta, because he had some pretty interesting comments at the weekend about being ready to lead KTM as their factory rider and then also heading off to the factory during the course of the summer break.
Yeah, it was quite entertaining, really. I mean, it's always fairly entertaining to go and speak to Pedro after a race, but I think on Sunday it was even more so, just because he was detailing that the first part of his summer holiday is going to be spent in Mattighofen in Austria, next to the KTM's factory. I think he said, "I've bought a one-way ticket. I don't know when I'm coming home. I don't know when I'll need to come home," and that. He was kind of giving the impression that he was going to sit down with some of the management and the top people and really understand, what is going on here. Because obviously it was just back in Catalonia, wasn't it? 4 rounds ago when Pedro was fighting for victory. He said he had the bike for victory the previous race in France, and was obviously on the podium in Austin. And you kind of thought, wow, this kid could even maybe fight for the championship this year. But yeah, KTM really have had a lackluster couple of rounds. I think Pit Barrer was interviewed by Simon Crafart just before the MotoGP race, and he was Pitt is a straight talker, but he was just saying, frankly, this isn't good enough. We were expecting to be far higher. We were expecting to be fighting for the podium in every race, and we've been way off it in the last couple of rounds. And yeah, Acosta just seems to be taking that kind of initiative to go and understand exactly what's going on. I think it was also interesting. He was saying, my Moto3 team, my Moto2 team, it was essentially 6 guys. And they were at the track all the time. Whereas KTM, there's so many people working back in the factory, and he was kind of going, or his intention is to go so he can put names to faces and get to know everyone. And I think, it's obviously a very mature thing to do, to kind of take this initiative upon yourself and to go and try and, get himself basically like acclimatized and then, up to speed with everything that's going on there. But it's also, you got the impression a little bit him saying what is happening at the moment is not acceptable. Let's all pull our finger out here because, we can't be finishing 7th every weekend.
I think it's a little bit cryptic. He mentioned he hasn't really been to the factory that much, even though he's been, achieving world championships in Moto2 and Moto3. But Pedro, the last time I think he was in Austria was when he was doing the preseason photo shoot and videos. I was taking part in that for KTM, and we've run some of the content on the podcast, in fact. And, he was actually walking around the motor hall and learning a lot about the KTM sort of story then. But since that moment when, Acosta was joining sort of the latest flute of rookies to go into the KTM structure, would he sink or swim? he's obviously had far more clout. And if he is ready to lead sort of KTM's rider roster for the future, then that's probably why he wants to go and knock on some doors. But having said that, I would think at this stage of the season, there wouldn't be that many race personnel in Mundafing at the motorsport headquarters because MotoGP has entered the summer break. So maybe he is just having a couple of meetings of 1 or 2, 3 key people and then go into the Red Bull Athlete Performance Center or whatever it's called. But yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it. I can't see what he would achieve in just hanging around Mundafing. Seems a bit strange.
Yeah, and I think he actually had a really good race on Sunday. I'm not sure. I don't think we really talked about it on our Sunday show, but his ride, I think his start device basically didn't deactivate going into turn 1, and he had to ride the first couple of corners with it still down, and then that obviously lost him loads of positions. I think he was down maybe as low as 14th. Terrible first lap, and he came through to 7th, led that sort of second group behind the horde of Ducatis. And Miguel Oliveira, and it was a really good ride. And he was asked after the race, good race, good weekend for you, and he was just like, no. You could tell that he was a bit fed up with where things are at the moment. So that kind of gave me the impression that he wanted to do this trip to sort of try and almost rally, do a bit of a rally call.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how quickly the expectations change for riders, and suddenly you're waiting for that big step, especially after you have a podium so early, like we saw from Acosta. Dave, I had mentioned that VJ had asked us a question about the rider lineup for KTM next season and why Bastianini and Viñales would decide to move over to KTM. The way that he views it is the pecking order is very clear. It's Ducati, Aprilia, and then quite a gap back to KTM. So what justifies their decision? I know obviously we had Maverick on the pod last week with Adam talking about it, but for you, what justifies the decisions for those 2 riders?
Well, I mean, Enea Bastianini, there was interest for him at Aprilia. Bastianini gets to work with his old crew chief, Giri Buola, who was also Dovi's crew chief. I think that's a strong relationship that helped him. That helped persuade him. I think also just sort of the structure that's being offered, the package that's being offered for Maverick Viñales. I think basically Maverick just felt a little bit neglected because all of Aprilia's focus was on signing Jorge Martin, and they seem to have no interest in. They were just completely ignoring Maverick Viñales, assuming that everything would be going along. And sort of 99% of rider decisions are rider contract decisions are made because riders feel slighted. It's all about dented egos. And I think this is another one that is about dented egos. Again, the package that's being offered there is, it's going to be a full factory bike, full factory support. It's going to basically be a second factory, KTM factory team. So this is the best opportunity to be competitive. But I do think that for Viñales, a lot of it was also just about him feeling slighted.
Also, I mean, in the case of Bastianini, he lost his job. So that was another thing. I mean, he had to find another option. And then for Maverick, I think also some clues were in his media debrief on Sunday in Germany, where he was saying that the Aprilia was hard to understand during the race. It sounded like there was some sort of maybe glitch, some electronic issue where, he was just missing performance in key parts of acceleration. He said he couldn't really understand the motorcycle to be able to push it enough. And I think, just judging by the stuff he's saying and his demeanor, that there are these inconsistencies. Even though it's a full factory team, there are these little kind of rough edges, and maybe he's just tired of that. Maybe he's thinking I'll get something maybe a little bit more uniform or consistent by switching to sort of KTM's factory thing. I mean, it's like anything, it's a punt when you change team manufacturers. And at the moment, you'd say if they change during mid-season, you think, why on earth would you do that? But then, these riders obviously have their mini frustrations, where they've been.
Yeah, we've one last question just to cover as well. We had plenty more questions in, but unfortunately only time for one more question, and it's related to Aprilia and Trackhouse. So Paul McMullen was asking whether or not Trackhouse will get the support of 2 full 2025 bikes for next season. while we also had a question in from Coxey who was asking if Trackhouse's showing at the weekend is just down to having the extra support from Aprilia because Aleix wasn't racing at the weekend, or whether or not this was a genuine weekend where they made a massive step forward.
I think it was. I think regarding will they have 225 bikes next year? I think yes, you would have to say, because Raul Fernandez, I think from Silverstone, will have the 24 machine, which means that him and Miguel will be on very similar packages. So yeah, you would imagine that Justin Marks will be pushing for that to continue next year. I think it's also more helpful for Aprilia because we know that Yamaha will have 4 bikes on the grid, more or less identical at the start of the year, KTM as well. Ducati maybe only 3. So yeah, I think it really would be in Aprilia's interest to do 4 identical bikes for 2025. Our I think it was Coxey, made a pretty salient point, which was the fact that Aleix wasn't there. Miguel was having a bit more, I think, contact with some of the factory Aprilia engineers over the weekend, and he did say that was one of the reasons which maybe contributed to his success. I think another aspect of it was the fact that the Aprilia was working pretty well at the Sachsenring, not quite in the same league as the Ducatis, but was still doing pretty well. Obviously is a pretty good bike when it's turning, especially when it's on throttle, and there's a lot of that at the Sachsenring, and it's a great track for him as well. 2021 I think it was when he was pushing Marc pretty hard in the MotoGP race, just missed out and finished second. So I think it was a contribution of, it was kind of all of those factors mixed together.
Yeah, it's like anything else. There's always a lot goes in behind the scenes, and that's the same for us here on the Paddock Pass podcast. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, where we've got lots of additional content for all of our Patreon supporters. We've got a few different series coming up as well. There's the Gordo remembers for Superbikes. I've got a Race of My Life features, set of Race of My Life features coming up for Superbike riders as well. And then we've got all of our Paddock Notes shows and all the Grand Prix content. Also, for all of our Patreon subscribers and supporters, if you become an annual Patreon supporter for the Paddock Insiders tier, that's where you can enter our draw for one of 3 pairs of tickets for the British Grand Prix. We found Patreon to be a really good way to interact with all of our listeners on the Discord server as well. So check that out if you're looking to become a Paddock Insider or a Patreon supporter. And also, one of the other ways that we've been able to interact with everyone has been with the Alpinestars MotoGP Fantasy League. So, Adam, we're just terrible at it.
Steve, keep ignoring it, okay?
Keep going.
Ignoring it.
Keep going. Yeah, we're terrible at it, Ad. Neil, you've been pretty crap all year. Dave, your luck is about to turn. And,
making a resurgence.
The resurgence is on from what, 900 to 800?
600th actually, Steve.
Oh, sorry, Neil. Sorry, I've been selling you well short on that. I think as long as I keep it in triple figures, I'll be pretty happy, because we've got, I think it's about 1,300 players on the fantasy league this year. So we've had a big jump this year for everyone trying to give themselves something to have a bit of crack with for it. And certainly on the Discord server, that is one of the big talking points, is just how shit me and Adam are. I don't think it's going to change too much, because I keep looking at my team thinking, do you know what? Other than maybe having Tech 12, this isn't actually that bad. And then every week it just gets worse and worse. So,
Steve, let's Dave walk to the top of the podium right now. Go on, Dave.
Oh, no.
I'm not conceding it to David Emmett.
If
David's talking about 407 points left in the MotoGP World Championship, there's no way I'm saying that Dave's going to beat me in this. We've still got the second half of the year. I'm confident for it that Dave will implode rather than me and you will step forward at. But definitely it's been a lot of fun. Alpinestars have a big gift pack for the winner of this over the last couple of years, so I'm sure it'll be something similar again this year. So a big thank you to Alpinestars for supporting that. And Adam, you're going to be busy supporting England against Dave's Dutchman on Wednesday as well.
My Dutchman? They're not my Dutchman. They can
massive football fan.
Somebody else's Dutchman. Yeah.
Another thing, Steve, as well. One more question we have from Patreon was from Marcus Waymayer, who asked about some Paddock Pass podcast merch. This is something we've kind of talked about a little bit, and are people interested? Is anyone listening to this podcast who would like to wear a Paddock Pass podcast T-shirt or a hoodie, or you're so fashionably backwards that you would like to wear some of the stuff with our logo or colors on, then let us know. I mean, just send us a message on Twitter or wherever you listen to the podcast. Maybe it's something we can look into. At the moment, the people who do join us on Patreon get a mug, and I think Marcus has broken his mug, so that's why he's reaching out. We'll have to try and sort that out. But, give us some feedback. If you want some merch, we have to get some T-shirts going.
Or a Paddock Pass podcast double-breasted suit. How about that? That would look nice. Or a top hat. I always think there should be more top hats for.
No, there shouldn't, Dave, because Storm Stacey uses the top hat, and fair enough, it's a grand gimmick. When I saw him walking through the airport wearing it, I just thought that is just not cool, and it isn't.
But look at think of all the room for the sponsors.
The sponsors, yeah. Well, we've got Renthal, we've got KTM, and we got Fly Racing to thank for on this pod. So maybe we do need the top hat too.
Exactly. Yeah.
At the weekend, I was walking through the paddock, and at Sachsenring, you have to go down the stairs under the track and into the second paddock, where the teams have their hospitalities and service trucks. So we're just about to go down the stairwell, and a fan comes up the other way and blocks and stops David, looks at him, looks at his hat, and then smiles and starts to ask for a selfie. It was at this point I realized that brand David Emmett is live and well, certainly in the eastern region of Germany. So then I had to quickly get out of the way while he placated his fans.
I'd say if Dave went to the Far East, he'd be a popular man out at the flyaways. If we could ever tempt you to go to the flyaway rounds, Dave.
Well, we shall have to wait and see. I shall have to start selling some merch of my own to be able to afford it.
You have gone down the merch route in the past, Dave, so it wouldn't be a step into the unknown. We've got a busy couple of weeks coming up all the same, even with the summer break. We've got interviews planned. We've got, obviously, Superbikes are back-to-back, Donington and the Czech Republic round in Most. So we're going to have coverage from the two of those with Gordo, and hopefully we'll be able to get Evo back on. Obviously, the changes for him at Speed Week have made it a lot busier. So hopefully we're able to get Evo back on for the second half of the season. Superbike's back underway. It's been a pretty stretched out first half of the year for us, but it gets pretty busy going forward as well. So we'll be back next week, myself and Gordo, with a review of the UK round at Donington Park. But as ever, Adam, Dave, Neil, good to have you on the pod, and big thank you to Fly Racing, KTM, and to Renthal Street for supporting the Paddock Pass podcast.